Never run out of these 12 pantry staples. Hi, sweet friends. I'm Mary, and welcome to Mary's Nest, where I teach traditional cooking skills for making nutrient-dense foods like bone broth, ferment, sourdough, and more. So if you enjoy learning how to be a modern pioneer in the kitchen, consider subscribing to my channel, and don't forget to click on the little notification bell below. That'll let you know every time I upload a new video. If at any time you want to jump ahead, be sure to check the description underneath this video or the pinned comment, where I'll list the timestamps with everything I'm going to cover. If you're the one in charge of keeping a well-stocked pantry in your home, then these are 12 pantry staples you never want to run out of. Now, these are the type of pantry items or pantry staples that you can stock either in your working pantry or your extended pantry, what we nickname the prepper pantry, because these 12 pantry staples are all non-perishable foods. And the reason you want to stock these particular pantry staples and never run out of them is because they are sort of your first line of defense, so to speak, your first line of ingredients that you're going to need to build very basic things, very basic meals. This is the first level. And if you have these on hand, then you can go from there. But without these, this may keep you from even getting started. So speaking of getting started, let's get started. Item number one is all-purpose flour and bread flour. All-purpose flour, or some of you may know it as plain flour, is exactly that. It's all-purpose. It's something that you can use to bake anything with. Now, is there bread flour, which we're going to talk about in a minute? Is there cake flour? Is there this or that, bleached flour, so on and so forth? Yes. But if you can just stock one flour, all-purpose flour is going to be the one that you're going to want to have on hand, because you can use it to make quick breads, muffins, cakes, yeast-risen breads, sourdough breads. You can use it to feed your sourdough starter. You can use it to thicken gravies. It really is, as the name implies, all-purpose. But I also recommend that you consider stocking bread flour. Bread flour is slightly higher in protein, which is made specifically for baking bread. Bread flour can help you be more successful when baking bread. It can help you with a better rise in your bread. So when it comes to flours, think about all-purpose flour and bread flour. Both of them have had the bran and the germ removed, so are they less nutritious than your whole grain flours? Yes, but they have a longer shelf life. And in this video, I really want to focus on those 12 pantry staples that are things that you really never want to run out of. This is sort of the bare minimum. I've talked in other videos about stocking whole grain flours and all the different types of whole grain flours you can stock, as well as whole grain, and how to grind whole grain and how to sift whole grain to turn it into the type of flour that you need, and so on and so forth. And I'll be sure to link to all of those videos so that you can watch that depending where you are on your journey from sort of what I often say, a journey from a processed foods kitchen to a traditional foods kitchen. And all of that is wonderful. But we're just going to focus on very specific basic pantry staples, and this can be very helpful for the beginner, and even for those of us who are more advanced but sometimes forget that having these basic pantry staples will always allow us to get started with making some basic meals. So that's where we're going with this list. Now, once you have your flour and you want to bake bread, always remember you want to keep some yeast on hand. Now, you have a choice of packaged yeast, which you buy at the grocery store, or your wild yeast, your sourdough starter specifically. But definitely have some packaged yeast on hand. It comes in very handy, especially when maybe you have to bake bread quickly and don't have time to make sourdough. And once you get that packaged yeast, whether you buy a large container or the little individual packets, keep that in your freezer, because that's going to really extend its shelf life. And when it comes to sourdough starter, That's wonderful to have on hand if you're a sourdough baker. But even if you are a sourdough baker and you have an active sourdough starter, think about dehydrating some of that sourdough starter so that you can store that all dried and cracked up in shards or ground into a powder, so that in the event that your sourdough starter fails at any point, or I've had women tell me that accidentally, maybe husbands, I know men are baker too, so maybe wives have done this, or girlfriends or boyfriends accidentally threw out the starter thinking that it was just some messy little thing that needed to be washed up. So make sure that you do have that dehydrated sourdough starter on hand that you can then rehydrate and get ready to use to bake bread with. Now, keep in mind, you don't need any kind of fancy equipment. You can dehydrate sourdough starter very easily, and you can just do this with the air. You don't need a dehydrator. You don't even need an oven. If you spread it really, really thin on a piece of parchment paper and leave that, you put it on the parchment paper on a baking sheet, just spread it out real, real thin. The air will dry it, and probably by the next day, it'll be nice and crisp so that you can go ahead and store that in a jar in your prepper pantry, as is, just in the shards. That's usually how I store it. Or you can grind it up into a powder and store it that way. Either way will work. So make sure packaged yeast, but also your sourdough starter and your sourdough starter dehydrated backup. Number 3, baking powder. And in the case of baking powder, you want to make sure that you do use that within its best by date. Yes, can you use it after the best by date? Of course. But it may not give you the same rise as it would if it was fresher. So always be a little astute to what the best by date is on your baking powder. You know, with other items, I tell you, don't worry about the best by date. Many things will last well beyond that. But when it comes to baking powder, it is a good thing to have baking powder that's as fresh as possible. And why do you want baking powder? Because often that's what you're going to need if you're going to make quick breads. So you want to have that on hand for those days that you don't want to make a yeast bread or a sourdough bread. You have your baking powder, you can throw together a quick bread, or you can throw together muffins. Baking powder is also handy when making pancakes or waffles or different things like that. So keep your baking powder well stocked and nice and fresh in your pantry, and you're going to be all set with everything that you need to make a quick bread. Number 4, which kind of goes hand in hand with baking powder, and that's baking soda. And again, the fresher the better. Now, does baking soda often last well beyond its best by date? Yes. And is it wonderful for cleaning and different things like that? Yes. And can you test it to see if it's very active by mixing it with a little vinegar? Of course. And if it bubbles up beautifully, then you know your baking powder is in good shape. But when it comes to baking, I really think you want to make sure that your baking soda is nice and fresh, because your baking soda is also used in various quick breads. Because if you're baking something that has an acid in it, maybe you're using buttermilk or yogurt or sour cream, often a recipe will call for baking soda, because the baking soda reacts with the acid, and then that combination helps rise whatever it is you're baking. So just like with baking powder, if you have baking soda also on hand, you're all set to do a lot of good, high-quality baking. Number 5, and this may be new to some of you, but those of you who are bakers will definitely be familiar with this: dry malt powder. Now, some of you may know this as barley malt powder, and others of you may know this, and I have to look at this because I always find this one hard to pronounce, diastatic powder. But whatever you call it, this can be a godsend when you're making yeast-based or sourdough breads to help with a really good rise. And you don't need a lot, often just a little teaspoon or so added to your flour, and this will really help you create yeast, or wild yeast or packaged yeast risen breads that really rise nicely and have a wonderful, as they say, crumb, the texture of the bread when you slice it. So, number 5, dry malt powder. Definitely consider adding this to your prepper pantry. I consider this a pantry staple and would not want to be without it. I love adding this to my breads. Now, can you find this at the grocery store? Often, yes. It'll be in the baking section where they have the flour and different things like that. If not, I'll put a link in the description below as to where you can find this online. I actually bought this one online. I like this brand, the Hoosier Hill Farm. If you buy various dried products, like dehydrated cream and milk and things like that, you may be very familiar with the Hoosier Hill Farm products. This is not a sponsored video. I just happen to really like their products. And I find that making sure that you have some barley, as I call it, barley malt powder in your pantry is going to be invaluable if you like to bake yeasted or sourdough breads. Number 6, you want to keep these thickeners on hand. And a lot is going to depend on what thickener you keep based on what foods you best tolerate. You can keep cornstarch, you can keep tapioca, or you can keep arrowroot powder. But keeping one of these 3 in your pantry is going to be wonderful when you need to thicken a sauce in which you don't want to thicken with flour. And tapioca flour specifically is wonderful for thickening pies. If you make fruit pies and you're cooking up the apples or the blueberries or the cherries, whatever the case may be, I love the way tapioca flour works for thickening fruit pies, as opposed to cornstarch, as opposed to arrowroot, as opposed to some flour. I think tapioca just gives the perfect consistency. So definitely consider keeping that in your prepper pantry, especially if you like, or your pantry, especially if you like making fruit pies or even different fruit mixtures like those wonderful apple desserts that then may have a crumb topping and different things like that, like an apple pan dowdy maybe even. But whatever you make, if you make something with fruit that releases a lot of juices, you're going to find tapioca is fantastic. And now let's take a minute to talk about arrowroot. Keeping arrowroot flour on hand is wonderful as well, because you can bake with arrowroot. You can make little crackers or cookies that children often enjoy and tolerate very well. Arrowroot was commonly used to make the arrowroot biscuits or the arrowroot cookies that were very common when I was a child. So having arrowroot on hand can be a wonderful backup to any all-purpose or bread flour you make if you want to make something that's very simple and generally very well tolerated by our digestive systems, especially if our digestive systems are having some I guess you could say trials and tribulations. But if you have a digestive system that may be in need of some healing or may just need some gentle foods, arrowroot biscuits can be, they're not biscuits in terms of what we think of, as sort of the Pioneer biscuits. They're more like a little cookie or a cracker. And they're so easy to make up. And just mixing with a little flour and water, roll it out, cut them out if you want. You can add a little sweetener if you want. But whatever way you make them, when you're using arrowroot flour, and there's lots of recipes, on the internet, they're a very simple food and can be easily digested by people who may have some digestive issues. So keeping all of those on hand. If you tolerate cornstarch is terrific. If you like making a lot of desserts and fruit pies, wherever you're using fruits, tapioca is wonderful. And also arrowroot, it makes a great thickener, especially if you can't use cornstarch, but it's also wonderful to actually bake things with. Number 7, never run out of salt. Salt is such a pantry staple, and you really want to have a variety of salts. Definitely, as I've shared with you, I really like that wet, coarse grind French sea salt. I find that delightful. You can also use the real salt that comes out of Utah here in the United States. But you also want to make sure that you have some salts like canning and pickling salts if you like to do canning, or you like to make quick pickles. Having some canning and pickling salt on hand is also a good idea. And as I've discussed in other videos, especially when it comes to what to put into your prepper pantry or your survival pantry or your emergency pantry, and these can be all areas of your prepper pantry, is iodized salt. You want to make sure that you do have some salt on hand that does contain iodine. In the event that you are ever in a situation or an emergency where you were no longer able to get foods that are rich in iodine, like fresh seafood or canned seafood. And so having that iodized sea salt can be put into your diet, into whatever foods you are eating, and it'll protect your thyroid. It'll prevent you from getting a condition known as goiter, which is where your thyroid becomes enlarged and then it doesn't function properly. And it's very important to keep our thyroid healthy, because the healthier our thyroid is, the healthier we are, because the thyroid controls a lot of functions in the body. So it's great to have the sea salts that we love, and it's wonderful to have canning and pickling salts, but you also want to keep in mind to have some iodized salt on hand. And I also want to mention, when it comes to sea salts, they're wonderful for flavoring our food, but they're also very important for using when we make ferments, fermented vegetables. Because ferments, as I've shared with you many times in the past, can be persnickety. So whatever we put into our ferment, we want to make sure that they are ingredients that are going to agree with and help the fermentation process, not hurt the fermentation process. And the problem with your typical table salts and whatnot that you can buy at the grocery store is that they often contain anti-caking agents and other chemicals that can interfere with the fermentation process. So having sea salts that are very plain and very simple salts and just salt and rich in minerals that can often sometimes help the fermentation process, it's a very good thing to always make sure that if you like making ferments, that you do make sure that your pantry is well stocked with sea salt. Number 8, sugar, or some sort of alternative whole sweetener. White sugar is great to have on hand, and I know some of you who are saying, Mary, you have a Traditional Foods Kitchen, why are you saying white sugar? The reason I'm saying white sugar is that there are some preparations that for many of us, white sugar comes in handy. Sometimes a little bit of white sugar can help kickstart a struggling sourdough starter. Sometimes if you like to make jams and jellies, which I do recommend making low sugar ones, but if you don't like the color imparted into your jams and jellies by some of your whole sweeteners, then white sugar is a good option to have to use, and you want to make sure you have that in your pantry. And keep in mind, you're not going to be using white sugar in abundance. You're going to be using it in limited amounts. Well, at least that's what I recommend, that you use it in limited amounts. But having some white sugar in your pantry on hand at all times will have uses. Also too, sometimes a little sugar if you don't want to use some of the alternative sweeteners because they do have stronger flavors. Sometimes a little sugar can be useful in a recipe like a spaghetti sauce to cut back on some of the acidity. So just make sure that you have at least one bag of white sugar in your pantry and you'll be all set. And when it comes to those alternative whole sweeteners, yes, you want to make sure you have those in your Traditional Foods pantry as well. You can have Sucanat, also in Europe it's called Rapadura. These are just brand names, and basically what they are dried sugarcane juice. So it's the sugar, but in its natural form, sort of the original brown sugar. They've just taken the sugarcane juice, they've dried it, it's got a dark brown color to it, and that's called Sucanat or Rapadura. And you definitely want to have that in your pantry in a Traditional Foods kitchen. Can you have maple syrup? Definitely. Can you have maple sugar? Yes, of course. Once maple syrup is open, though, you should refrigerate it. But until you open it, it can be left in your pantry or your extended pantry. Maple sugar is shelf stable, but both maple syrup and maple sugar are becoming a little costly. So that may be something to keep in mind as you are grocery shopping to kind of keep your budget and your grocery budget intact. You may find that the Sucanat will be less expensive. Other options for whole sweeteners are date syrup or date sugar, molasses, honey. There's a whole spectrum of real whole sweeteners, and it's going to be a matter of you finding what you like and what agrees best with your palate. However, just one little caveat about honey. Generally, I recommend raw honey because it's very rich in nutrients. And it's best not to be heated when it's raw because you would be destroying all the good things that exist in honey when it has been unheated. So keep some honey in your pantry. Preferably find raw honey, which is really the only honey I recommend keeping on hand for the most part. But make sure you have that in your pantry. And it's wonderful for sweetening things where you're just drizzling a little honey on top of and not heating it. And it's also wonderful to keep on hand if you like to make home remedies. Because raw honey, as I mentioned, is very rich in nutrients. It can be wonderful for soothing a sore throat, wonderful for soothing a cough. You can mix it with some different herbs and let it steep. So there's a lot that you can do with raw honey, and you just need a small amount. And I want to mention something about molasses. Molasses does have a strong flavor to it. There are different types of molasses. There's sort of your regular molasses and then your blackstrap molasses, which tends to be stronger but also richer in nutrients. But keeping molasses on hand is a very smart thing to do. And it's not something that you necessarily need to have in your working pantry if it's not a flavor that you find to be something that you want to be, drizzling on yogurt or using in baking, although I think molasses cookies and molasses cakes are wonderful. I love the rich flavor that it brings to those. But it's definitely something, no matter how you feel about molasses, no matter how you use it, it's definitely something you should at least be keeping in your prepper pantry and always making sure you have at least one bottle of it. And the reason is molasses is very rich in iron. And if you're ever in an emergency situation where you may no longer be able to get foods that are rich in iron, which are especially important for children and teenagers because they're growing, adults, there's a lot of things we can do without, but children and teenagers need a lot of iron. And something my mother always did when I was a little girl was she would put a little bit of molasses in milk and have me drink that every day. And she got me used to the flavor, and then she would just increase it. And I would even be doing that as a young woman in my 20s to make sure that I was getting enough iron to stay healthy and strong. And so that is definitely something that you want to keep on hand. And even if you get into a situation where maybe even milk is limited, if you've seen some of my other videos where I talk about foods to keep in your prepper pantry, having some sort of dry milk on hand. You can have whole dry milk or you can have non-fat dry milk. Either or, you want to look for ones that have been low temp dried, so they do as little damage to the proteins in milk as possible. You can reconstitute that. You can put a little bit of molasses in that, and maybe add in a little honey to maybe disguise the flavor of the molasses in the beginning. But if sometimes, because that may be all we have, or food supply is very limited, and we don't have the usual meats or chickens or fish that we have, or maybe we've run out of our canned proteins, that little bit of molasses may serve us very well, especially for our children and teens. Number 9 are flavored extracts. I highly recommend that you at the very least keep some vanilla extract on hand. And you can even make this homemade. I have a video where I show you how to do it. It's basically perpetual. You can just keep adding to it over time. You make it with a little alcohol and some vanilla beans, and you let it steep for about 6 months, and then you decant it, and then you top it off with some more alcohol, and so on and so forth. And it really should last you. Those vanilla beans should be able to create vanilla extract for a very long time. And so I'll definitely link to that video. But I want to mention that you can also make a multiple of flavored extracts. You can make lemon, you can make orange, you can make mint, and I have another video where I show you how to make a variety, a total of 10 flavored extracts. And so that's a good skill to learn how to make these things homemade, and then to make sure you never run out of them. Make sure you always have them in your working pantry, because how nice it is when you want to bake a quick bread or some muffins, or you're doing pancakes, or you're doing waffles, to have vanilla extract on hand, or one of the other flavored extracts really gives a wonderful punch of flavor to your food. Now, I know some of you have asked me, can you make flavored extracts without using alcohol? And yes, you can. And I will definitely link to my friend Heidi over at Rain Country Homestead. I think many of you know Heidi. Heidi shows how to make a myriad of flavored extracts without using alcohol. And so I'll be sure to link to her channel, and I'll see if I could find those specific videos. But if I'm not able to, just leave her a comment on her most recent video, and I'm confident then she can direct you to a playlist where she has those videos for making different types of flavored extracts without using alcohol. Number 10, you want to make sure that you have plenty of dry seasonings on hand, because these are going to bring all types of flavor levels to whatever you're cooking. You want to keep dried herbs on hand, dried spices, maybe some onion powder, garlic powder, all things like that. And you don't need to have hundreds of spices. You can have some basic ones, because I show you how to take basic herbs and spices to make lots of spice and herbal blends. And I'll be sure to link to that video. They're very easy to do. And all you need to keep is some basic things on hand. Maybe some dried parsley, some dried thyme, dried oregano, dried basil, maybe some bay leaves. For spices, things like chili powder, coriander, cumin, turmeric, different things like this. And then together you can build wonderful seasoning mixes. And what's nice is you can use these seasoning mixes in all different types of ways to flavor your food. You can use them as rubs, you can use them to simply season a soup or a stew. You can use some of them to make different types of teas that can be very healing. And I have videos where I show you how to do all these things. I also have a seasoning mix that I show you how to make that is a nutrient-dense seasoning mix, and nobody's going to know that it's nutrient-dense. It tastes delicious, and it's got all kinds of things in it that are wonderful for nourishing your body. So, yeah, because you got to keep in mind, herbs and spices have a lot of like sort of home remedy medicinal purposes to them. So not only are you stocking something that serves culinary purposes, you may find that a little thyme steeped in honey is wonderful for soothing a cough. A little turmeric warmed in some milk can make you feel better when you have a cold. There's all types of things you can do. So always make sure your pantry is stocked with some basic herbs and spices, and that way you will always have everything you need to not only flavor your food, but to nourish your body in healing ways as well. So never run out of those. Number 11, you want to keep vinegar on hand. Now, in previous videos, I've talked about the importance of keeping white vinegar on hand because it's very good at killing bacterial infections on the skin, especially if you have a wound or an incision or something like that, and you're in a situation where you have no, like an antibiotic cream or something like that, and you really have to rely, you may be on a home remedy until you can get the medical treatment that you need. And, you know, as I've said, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a medical professional, but this is something that a doctor of mine shared with me, that it's very good to always have vinegar in the home to help with cleansing and wounds and keeping them free of infection, or maybe trying to get rid of an infection. And I'll link to the video where I talk about crucial things that you really want to keep in your prepper pantry, one of which is white vinegar. And in there I share a story as to how it really saved the day for me when I had an incision after an operation on my foot, and we were right at the beginning of the pandemic. And it was a little rough road there for a while, getting what I needed to heal. But in any event, white vinegar not only has kind of like the herbs and spices, its medicinal side, it's also a wonderful culinary vinegar to have on hand. It's wonderful if you like to do pickling, and as well as canning, and it's a wonderful basic vinegar for making salad dressings and marinades and things like that. But also, if in your pantry you want to have other vinegars, and maybe you just want one other vinegar, you have to have apple cider vinegar. And you want to make sure that it's raw apple cider vinegar that's very rich in what they call the mother, which are the good probiotics. If I'm saying that right, I know a lot of times I say probiotics. I'm the queen of mispronunciation. But raw apple cider vinegar is very rich in probiotics, which are very good for nourishing our digestive systems. And as scientists tell us, the healthier our guts, as they say, are, I don't know if that's a scientific term, but the healthier our digestive system is, and the more nourished it is with good probiotics, the healthier we are. So you can use that apple cider vinegar definitely to make salad dressings, marinades, so on and so forth, but a little mixed in water can help quell indigestion. A little mixed in water with honey can be very soothing to a sore throat. So apple cider vinegar, and when it's raw, really is a wonderful vinegar to keep in your pantry. And even better, you don't even need to buy it. You can make a raw apple cider vinegar even with just apple scraps. If you've got cores and peels and a few other pieces of apple, or even if you want to just make it from the actual apple that you've cut up, you can do that. And maybe sometimes if the apples aren't super sweet, you maybe add a little sugar just to feed the good bacteria, and that'll start to proliferate, and in 30 days, you're going to have a wonderfully acidic apple cider vinegar that then you can decant. You strain out the apples, you decant it, you put it in your pantry, and you're all set. And often if you've made it with scraps, it hasn't cost you anything really, other than the initial cost of the apples, but hopefully you've eaten those or cooked with them and enjoyed them, and the scraps may have otherwise gone into the garbage or the compost pile, and instead you've produced this wonderful apple cider vinegar, and then can put the scraps. You can put them into your compost pile, and I think your compost pile might thank you for the good bacteria that has since developed on the little apple pieces. They become a little mushy and whatnot, so it's not so much for consumption. But you're going to strain that out, and you're going to have some wonderful apple cider vinegar. I have videos where I show you how to make raw apple cider vinegar, and it's a 3-part series because I walk you through the 30-day process. So there's no stone unturned, so to speak. There's no question as to what you need to do, and it's very easy. It's basically just a lot of stirring. Well, not a lot, but a lot in terms of if you added it up over the 30 days, but you're just stirring in the morning, stirring at night, and after 30 days, you're going to have a wonderful raw apple cider vinegar. So remember that. Make sure you never run out of vinegar. Number 12 is some type of shelf-stable fat. Now, I really like to keep olive oil on hand, and I find olive oil is extremely versatile because you can do so much with it. You can cook with it at about 350 degrees Fahrenheit. You can use it to make mayonnaise. You can use it to make salad dressing. You can do so much with olive oil. You can even use it as a moisturizer for your skin. Now, olive oil comes in different grades. I like to only use extra virgin olive oil, but if you find that that has a strong flavor, what you want to look for is an extra virgin olive oil that has been pressed from older olives, the more mature olives. That should be milder in color and milder in flavor, versus the extra virgin olive oil that has been pressed from the young green olives, which will be very green and have a very, generally a more intense flavor. A more green, or more like, it's like, for me, I find it's like a fresh green flavor. However, that's not your only option. Now, that's just, if I just had to pick one, I would go with olive oil. I think that probably has to do with my Italian heritage. But other shelf-stable fats that you might like are avocado oil. It's not something I've ever really developed a taste for, and in essence, it's not truly a traditional fat. It's not something that cultures have been using for hundreds or thousands of years. But I believe that the concept of avocado oil, being able to actually extract the oil from the avocado and then bottle it and actually have an oil, may have been developed in the 1990s. I'm not 100% sure, but it's a newer oil, and it's not one that I've really developed a taste for. But in any event, I thought, I might be wrong in this, I thought it was a scientist in Australia who developed the technique or the equipment for extracting the oil successfully from the avocado. If you know more about this, definitely let us know in the comments below. But if you like the taste of avocado oil and you find that that's something that agrees with you, you can certainly keep that on hand. Other oils, especially if you like making a homemade mayo and you don't want to do a 100% olive oil homemade mayo, a wonderful combination which was developed by Mary Innig, Dr. Mary Innig, who was a co-author of Nourishing Traditions with Sally Fallon, who she really focused on fats. And I think she also wrote another book called Know Your Fats, which is outstanding. And Dr. Innig found that the combination of olive oil, coconut oil, which is very shelf-stable, and sesame oil created a lovely mayonnaise. And each of those three oils, not the toasted sesame oil, just plain sesame oil, brought a wonderful complex of nutrients to the diet. And so she really liked that mix. But getting back to shelf-stable fats, so you could have your olive oil. Another option is coconut oil, if you like that. And a third option would be ghee, which I've really come to like. And ghee is basically a form of clarified butter. If you have just plain clarified butter, that has the milk solids removed right away as the butter oil, in essence, melts away from the milk solids. Ghee, on the other hand, allows the milk solids to float to the bottom and toast a little bit during the melting process to remove the milk solids. However, it lets those milk solids toast a bit, which imparts a lovely flavor to the clarified butter, and then called ghee, which it's common in Indian recipes from the country of India. You may be familiar in seeing ghee listed in recipes for Indian dishes. So those are three very good fats that I like to keep in my pantry and never run out of: olive oil, coconut oil, and ghee. So definitely stay well stocked with those. Alrighty, so don't run out of any 12 of these. If you keep these on hand, you're going to be in good shape. Now, if you want more information that's more detailed, that goes into a lot of information on each of these categories and how to stock your prepper pantry, how to do it with real food, how to stock it for a little more, no more than $5 a week, added to your grocery budget, how to store the food to make it last, and a whole host of subjects regarding stocking the pantry. Be sure to click on this video over here where I have a full playlist with everything I mentioned and lots more. And I'll see you over there in my Hill Country kitchen. Love and God bless.